My name's Greg, and we're going to talk about Jesus of Nazareth, the man. Before we do that, I'd like to start off with a prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. And this prayer is one of the Psalms, Psalm 67. Psalms are great prayers they cover just about any emotion that you might have. May God have pity on us and bless us, and may he let his face shine upon us. So may your way be known upon the earth, and among all nations your salvation. May the peoples praise you, O God. May all the peoples praise you. May the nations be glad and exult, because you rule the people with justice. The nations on the earth you guide. May the peoples praise you, O God. May all the peoples praise you. The earth has yielded its fruits. God, our God, has blessed us. May God continue to bless us, and may all the ends of the earth fear him. Amen. Okay. Linda, would you pass these out? Tonight we're talking about Jesus of Nazareth, and what we're going to do is kind of get to know Jesus the man a little bit. And but before we do that, I'm going to follow some of these things on the screen. The question I ask you is, how do we know what we know about Jesus of Nazareth? How do we know what we know about Jesus of Nazareth? Now, obviously, none of us have met him. He hasn't knocked on our door and come over for dinner. So how do we know what we know about Jesus? How do you know what you know about Jesus? Where do you get your information from? From the Bible, from the readings. Where else?
Personal experience.
Pardon?
Personal experience.
Personal experience. Where else? Church. From your experience in church. Where else? Who was the first one to teach you about Jesus? Maybe, maybe not.
Right.
Parents. Yeah, there's a lot of what our parents taught us, what we learned in school if we went to a Catholic or religious school, what we heard in church if we went to church, as young people. Art, music, film. We get our image of Jesus from a lot of places, don't we? And a lot of them, are different. A lot of different images. Just talking about that, I got a couple of images. I got a couple of images just from art. Father Austin talked about this a little bit last week, but some of us may have grown up. My grandparents were Polish, very Catholic. So my grandparents and my parents always had religious objects, pictures at the home. So a lot of my image of who Jesus is and how I picture him was influenced by pictures like this. The Greek icons are a different type of art, but give us a different image of who Jesus is. Some pictures of what Jesus did. Here's an image of a black Jesus. And it's interesting because, we as white Americans, We always picture Jesus kind of as white, but, the Middle East and the Jews of 2,000 years ago were kind of a hodgepodge of racial flavors. So who knows? Point is, we really don't know what Jesus looked like. Remember that the movie by Mel Gibson, The Passion. I mean, that was a very powerful one. And the image of Jesus there, played by Jim Caviezel, is kind of sticks in my mind a lot. Oops. Where did my mouse go? Up. Go. Let me go back here. This is one that my parents had hanging in our house from a very, it's the first kind of almost image I had of Jesus. Here was one that was, I don't know where that one's from. This one is over there, and it's a modern painting by an artist named Hook, and his art, his vision of Jesus is very friendly, very welcoming, I find. So, but as Steve rightly said, we also get our image of Jesus from what we've read in the Bible or what we hear preached in church, the readings in church. So we get our knowledge of Jesus from the Gospels. Now, there are 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, named after the guys who purportedly had written them. But the Gospels are not history, they're not news, they're not just stories. The Gospels are kind of complicated because they're witness. They're written by people who believe in the person and mission of Jesus. So the Gospels are a witness. They're not unbiased at all. Matter of fact, they're very biased in favor of trying to get the readership to also believe in Jesus. So we have to keep that in mind. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Mark was the first one written around 65 AD. Matthew and Luke were written probably around 80 AD. And John was the last to be written probably around 100, 110, 120 AD. So they weren't like news accounts written, by a reporter watching Jesus walk along the way. They were written years after the Christian community had time not only to experience Jesus, but to reflect on who Jesus was and what his meaning was for them and for the world. So, their writing was very important in terms of not only telling us something about Jesus, but telling us the why, telling us why Jesus did these things. So that's what we're going to focus on tonight, is to consider our image of Jesus. Each of us, as we're going through this, how do you picture Jesus? How do you, and maybe picking up on some clues that we read in the Gospels, maybe we can kind of fill out that image that each of us has a little bit. What was he like? What kind of a man was he? What kind of a person was he? And maybe sometimes, and that might help form or reform our image of who Jesus was. What you have in front of you is the roadmap of where I'm going. So Uh, any gospel quote that I cite here on the front page, well, most of them are on the back, so we don't have to go charging through the Bible to find them. And I'll point out the ones that I want to focus on a little bit. So if you get lost, that's where we're going. Okay. So the first question, the first part is, what do we know about Jesus before his public ministry? And what I mean by that is before he took to the roads and started preaching as an itinerant preacher. What do we know about him? And how do we know that? Well, we know his parents were Mary and Joseph. They're mentioned a few times, especially in the beginning of Matthew and the beginning of Luke. We know that his family, through Joseph, was related to the family of King David. Now, why is that important? Well, that's important because the Jews believed that the one they were expecting to come to save them, whatever that means for us, was going to be of the house of David. Why? Because David was the greatest of the Jewish kings. He was a godly man. Yeah, he sinned, but he was a godly man. And you might say that during his reign, during his time as king, Israel, it was like the golden age of Israel. Okay, they were prosperous, they were at peace, whatever fights they fought, they won. So, David was kind of their model, their image. This is, he was the king par excellence. And so they figured that the Messiah, the one that would come, would be of the family of David and hopefully be kind of like David. So we'll see. The beginning, and I know you can't see this, and this one isn't on the back of the sheet, but this is the beginning of Matthew's gospel, and it's called a genealogy, and the writer kind of traces back. Notice the very end says, Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. Of her was born Jesus, who is called Messiah. Now, that's a very pregnant, sentence. A lot of information packed in there. Why? Because it tells us who his parents were, Mary and Joseph. It tells us that Jesus was born and was called the Messiah. That word Messiah, we're going to be treating that in a whole separate class, but that word Messiah means anointed one. Because King David, all the kings were anointed, all the priests were anointed, all the prophets were anointed. And by anointed, I mean, it's kind of, you take some nice smelling oil and you pour it over somebody's head. And that was kind of a sign that this person had a special mission. So the anointed one, we call the Messiah. That's a Hebrew word, Messiah. The Greek word is Christ. Christos means anointed one. So Jesus Christ really means Jesus the Messiah, Jesus the anointed one. Now look what the writer does here. He traces so-and-so was the father of so-and-so, so-and-so was the father of so-and-so, and he goes all the way back to David, because Matthew wanted to let people know that because of Joseph, Jesus was of the family of David. And that was important. And they go all the way back to Abraham. who was the father of the Hebrew people long before Moses. So this Bible text, which can be kind of boring if it's read during Mass, but it tells us a lot of information about who this Jesus was. Now, let's, I didn't finish here, but we know he was born in Bethlehem, but he grew up in Nazareth. If you look on the back there, the second quote, it says, or would somebody mind reading that? Denise, would you mind reading that? Luke 2:4 and 39.
Joseph went from Nazareth in Galilee to
Judea,
to the city of David called Bethlehem, because he was a descendant from the house and family of David. When they finished everything required by the law, they returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth.
Thank you. So those two lines, and if you notice, I kind of jump a bunch of verses because I wanted to point out that he was born in Bethlehem, but he grew up in Nazareth. He attended the synagogue in Nazareth. Nazareth was a big enough town that had its own synagogue, and the synagogue was where, the rabbis would teach, and really any adult male could stand up and read the scriptures and begin talking about it. So Jesus, probably from little up, learned a lot in the synagogue, learned about the scriptures. And remember, they didn't have Bibles like we have, that everybody gets one. There might have been one copy for a synagogue, and the kids had to start memorizing some texts and as a way of learning them, especially the Psalms, because those were their prayers, but also some of the important prophetic writings and historical writings as well. And he probably learned the circumstances of his birth from his mother. We don't know that for sure, but that's probable. And we probably worked as a carpenter because his dad was a carpenter. And typically in Jewish society, a son usually followed in the occupation of his father. Father taught him how to work, and, the son kind of worked with his dad until his dad couldn't work and then kept on going. So he probably was at least trained as a carpenter. Now, let's jump over here. We know, from reading the scriptures, that Jesus developed a very intimate relationship with God, whom he called his Father. That relationship must have influenced his sense of vocation. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, he got to know God through prayer, through reading the scriptures, very intimately. That's not something you do, when you start, going out on your own. It's something that kind of built up from his youngest years. If you turn on the back of the sheet to Luke 2:49, it's the fourth one down. Remember the story of how Jesus and his family, when he was 12, went to Jerusalem to celebrate the holy days, and Joseph and Mary left. They thought Jesus was with the rest of the family, the extended family, but turned out he wasn't. So they went back to Jerusalem and they found him in the temple talking with the teachers and the priests. And they said, "Son, why'd you do this to us? We've been looking all over for you." And his answer was, "Why are you searching for me?" And this is Luke 2:49. "Did you not know I must be in my Father's house?" It's reported in the story that he was about 12 when that happened. But you can see that answer, some people, I always kind of took it as kind of a smart answer. Why are you bad-mouthing your parents, kid? But think about it. At that age, he must have had a very deep relationship with God in order to feel free enough to stay behind not only to stay behind in the temple in Jerusalem when his parents went back home, but also to be talking with, the elders of that were in the temple, the rabbi, the teachers, the priests, talking to them about God, maybe, and about the scriptures and things like that. So that, it seems to me that intimate relationship that he had, which is echoed later on, kind of formed his vocation. Now, what do I mean by that? Normally, we use the word vocation if somebody's going away to be a priest or a brother or a sister. But his vocation, his calling in life, what was he on earth to do? You were even just talking about that, weren't you? What was your purpose in life? And, Jesus probably asking the same question. What is my purpose in life? What am I called to do? And that deep relationship that he must have had with God, whom he called Father, must have influenced that relationship quite a bit, and his vocation, which we'll see later. And the last point. At some time, Jesus must have been attracted to the preaching of his cousin, who was John the Baptist. Remember, in Luke's gospel, Mary was pregnant and went to visit her cousin Elizabeth, who was also pregnant. Elizabeth was the mother of John the Baptist. And John the Baptist came on the scene as someone who was calling people back to their relationship with God, challenging them. You know the story. He kind of was like a wild man out by the river, baptizing people for the forgiveness of sins and challenging them to live righteous lives. And Jesus must have heard about them from family, from extended family, must have heard about John, and decided to go out to see what was going on. And John, of course, was near the Jordan River, and the other side of the Jordan was pretty much desert, and which was where John apparently lived. So Jesus went out searching for him. And he approached John and asked to be baptized. And of course, that brought a whole lot of questions from John, because he had a sense of who Jesus was. John said, you come to me for baptism, but rather you should be baptizing me. Why do you say that? Because Jesus was obviously greater than John. And yet, Jesus said, no, let's do it this way. And on the back of the page, if you look at the fifth one down, Mark 1, 9 to 11, it says, in those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. Just as he was coming out of the water, he saw the heavens open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice from the heavens said, you are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased. It was a kind of a revelation. Did the crowd hear that? Don't know. But it seems like John and Jesus heard that. And it was kind of like
Yeah.
just postpone it.
Or change the reminder
Oh, okay. 4 hours. All right. No, we're not going to be here that long. Thank you. Thank you. Anyway, that event, and Jesus was older at this time, is seen by most people as kind of like the turning point. It's almost like Jesus was thinking, okay, what's my purpose? What am I doing? What am I called to do? And then he gets this revelation at that point of baptism saying, you are my beloved. I am well pleased with you. Kind of seems to be the pivotal event that moved Jesus out from his private life and into a more public life. And so his public ministry begins here. Anybody have any questions about where we've gone so far? Kind of see a little bit about his family, a little bit about who Jesus, kind of type guy. What can you deduce from being a carpenter or a construction worker about what Jesus might have looked like? Think about it.
Rough hands.
Huh?
Rough hands.
Rough hands?
Strong.
Probably strong, because in those days, carpenters not only worked the wood, they had to go down, chop down their own trees and bring them back, and saw them and chisel them. I always used to call it my Jesus tool. It's like a wood chisel, because it can do miracles with a little wood chisel and a hammer. But yeah, I would think, he was probably fairly strong, and had rough hands, and knew his way around tools, whatever tools they may have had. So you kind of get that. I mean, he in other words, in my image of Jesus, he wasn't a wimp. He wasn't, a little guy, kind of a weakling. He was a fairly strong, imposing figure. And I think that kind of comes out later in the Gospels as well. And yet, he had a very intimate relationship with God. It's almost, and we see later in the Gospels where this comes out, it's almost like he really knew God face to face, almost really knew who this God was. So he was a deep person, in addition to being a strong person. All right, well, I'm going to go to that second part. So, what do we know about Jesus during his public ministry? Well, it would be unusual, or let's just say it's not normal for us to see people walking around town preaching the gospel. Now, we have churches, but you don't, anytime you see somebody, they put them on TV and they call them a nut, don't they?
Yeah.
They're pretty much. But it wasn't unusual in Jesus's time, for men and or women to go preach about God, about God's coming kingdom, because they were in deep anticipation that somebody was coming that was going to help them, the people. And a lot of I wouldn't say a lot, but several that we know of, men who preached God's kingdom and preached a revolt against Rome as well, wound up being killed because of that. So it was kind of tricky times. Remember, the Romans were an occupying force. Roman soldiers were all through Israel, maybe not as strong in Galilee, and we're going to look at a map in a minute, as in Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was the capital. It's where the temple was and everything. So maybe not where Jesus grew up, not so strong a presence, but they were there. They were an occupying force. And the Roman tax collectors were always around. You may not see the soldiers, but you knew the tax collectors were there. That's something that hasn't changed too much, has it? So it's not unusual in that first century for itinerant preachers to be roaming around. They preached the kingdom of God, which was code for God becoming king of Israel again. God becoming king and taking his rightful place in Israel. Now, that may sound very religious, or maybe not, but it was an extremely political statement, because the one king and emperor was the Roman emperor. And anybody coming to proclaim another king was accused of sedition, accused of inciting revolt, regardless of whether it was God or somebody else. So the kingdom of God was very dangerous. They were very dangerous words. And it was very dangerous to preach about that, because that immediately brought you to the attention of the Roman authorities and of the Jewish authorities, because many of the Jewish priests and the rabbis who were kind of Roman collaborators didn't want to upset their apple cart, didn't want to upset, their position in society. So oddly enough, they were always challenging these guys who came around preaching the kingdom. And they called those guys Messiah. They wondered if this guy who is preaching the kingdom is going to overthrow the Roman occupation. Was this guy who is preaching the kingdom going to restore the prosperity and peace that Israel knew under King David? Still others saw this as a fulfillment of the promises and prophecies of the Hebrew scriptures. So they were expecting a Messiah. But most of the people wanted the Messiah to free them from the turmoil that they were living under at that point in time. Of course, we know that Jesus didn't do that. So anyway, so that's you got to keep that in mind. Now here's a little map, just so we can situate ourselves. This is Israel. I don't know if you can see it from where you're sitting, but up north is Galilee. Up here's the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus did a lot of fishing with his disciples. The Jordan River flows south all the way to the Dead Sea. And down here is Judea. This is where Jerusalem is. This is where Bethlehem is. It's about 70 miles, give or take, between Nazareth up here in Galilee and Jerusalem in Judea. And in the middle is a section called Samaria. You remember the story of the Good Samaritan, a guy from Samaria. Well, the Samaritans were kind of distant cousins of the Jews, because they had intermarried with non-Jewish people, so that they were maybe a fourth or a half Jewish, but not fully Jewish. And it was a mountainous area and very often fraught with robbers. So this keep this map in mind because most of Jesus' beginning of his ministry was up here in Galilee. up here in Galilee, around the Sea of Galilee. Here's Capernaum, a city that apparently Jesus kind of settled in once he left Nazareth on his mission. And most of it happened up there. When he went south and turned toward Jerusalem, that's kind of where, of course, he was executed and where his final days were spent. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind. Okay, he preached the kingdom of God and what God was like, and people were amazed. Turn on the back of that sheet and find Mark 6, 1 to 4. JD, would you mind reading that?
He left that place and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. On the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astounded. They said, "Where did this man get all this? What is this wisdom that has been given to him? What deeds of power are being done by his hands? Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, and
Joseph,
and
Judas,
and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him.
Okay, so there's a lot in that little paragraph too. First, he came back to his hometown, which of course was Nazareth. As we saw on the map, the Sea of Galilee and Capernaum, that was a little bit more populated. Why? Because a lot of men were fishermen, and that's how they made their livelihood, and people settled there. Nazareth was a little bit up in the highlands. So he came back there, and on the Sabbath he went to teach in the synagogue. Well, that's how we know that in Nazareth had a synagogue. It was big enough of a town to have its own synagogue. And many who heard him were astounded. There's an important idea to kind of get. We've all been students at one time or another. We've all been in school at one time or another. And we know when some teacher is talking like he just read the book the night before, as opposed to somebody who's talking like he's really experienced this stuff, whether it's math or English or history or whatever. He's talking like he really knows what he's talking about. And you thank God for those kind of teachers, because you can learn a lot from them. That's what I think this is referring to. Jesus spoke like he really knew who God was. And he really knew what God wanted for his people. And he really knew, how to communicate that. And people were astounded. Why? Because this was the carpenter. We said, he must have been a carpenter because his father was a carpenter. Well, there's another little clue there that tells us people knew him as a carpenter for his kind of hidden life before he became public. And then all of a sudden he's walking around teaching, and teaching with such authority, teaching with such charisma that, wow, where did he get all that? How did he learn that in Nazareth? And they were astounded. They were amazed at the way he taught, the way he spoke. So you see the image that we're getting? We're getting this guy who was a carpenter, fairly strong, rough hands, intimate knowledge of God, spoke with authority, like he really knew what he was talking about. Very charismatic kind of person. But that's kind of the clues that we get. Sometimes we skip over some of those clues when we read it or we hear it. But when we look at it closely, we do get a lot of information about who this Jesus was and how people saw him. Now, at the very end of what JD read, it said, "Isn't this the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon, and are not his sisters here with us?" And, some people say, well, Jesus came from a pretty big family. Well, brothers and sisters in Hebrew could mean brothers and sisters, siblings, or they could refer to the extended family, the cousins, as it were, the aunts and uncles, to the extended family of Jesus. So we do get a sense that, either on Mary's side or on Joseph's side, there was an extended family that would be there, that helped him to grow up, and that would be there to support him. Uh, so that's kind of what that means. Kind of like an extended family. But people were amazed. Number 4, it says, he healed the sick, and people were also amazed. Next week, we're going to talk about Jesus, the prophet and the healer, and we're going to go a little bit more into what his healings meant. But for the time being, he had the reputation as a healer, because even at one point, as we learn in Luke's gospel, a Roman soldier, centurion, in charge of 100 men, came to him and said, "Master, my servant is dying. Please help him." So, the Roman soldier would not have approached Jesus unless Jesus had that reputation as a healer. But we're going to get a little more of that next week. And also did something very interesting. He ate with sinners and tax collectors. And some people were upset by this. If you take a look on the back, Mark 2:15-17. Steve, would you mind reading that?
And as he sat down at dinner in Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were also sitting with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the scribes and Pharisees saw that he was eating with tax collectors and sinners, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard this, he said to them, "Those who are well do not need a doctor, only those who are sick. I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners."
Okay, we know what a tax collector is. Of course, in those days, the tax collectors worked for the Romans. So they collected taxes for the Roman occupiers, and in order to make a living, they had to kind of, increase the bill a little bit so that they could have something for themselves. People saw this as being collaborators with the Romans, as having forsaken their, the tax collectors had forsaken their religion, and many of them got wealthy that way, or at least wealthier than the people they were collecting taxes from. So tax collectors were, were despised. As far as sinners go, well, that goes back to what the law was for them. And the law was pretty strict in Jewish times. You couldn't walk. You could only walk so many steps on the Sabbath, because that the Sabbath was a day of rest. You couldn't touch a bloody corpse, because that would make you unclean. There was a lot of a lot of rules and regulations that made you unclean and therefore a sinner. So you had to then go purify yourself with a sacrifice in the temple or some other remedy. And so, the Pharisees and the scribes prided themselves on being upholders of the law. And they were kind of implying, well, if Jesus is all that smart, he would know who these people are. And Jesus, kind of sensing that attitude, said, I've not come to call the righteous, I've come to call sinners. Because he was offering God's mercy to those who were open to it. If you're not a sinner, then you're not open to God's mercy, to God's love. And some people didn't like that. And because he was challenging the status quo, those kinds of people started to plot his demise. Okay, so how did he live? Well, we know that he called Peter and James and John, made him his apostles. We know he always had a following no matter where he went. We also know that he had women who supported him, kind of like Martha and Mary, who lived in Bethany, which was a small village outside of Jerusalem. And whenever Jesus was in that area, he stayed at Martha and Mary's house. They also had their brother Lazarus, whom later in John's gospel, Jesus brings back from the dead. So Jesus, as this itinerant preacher, made friends, had disciples, had benefactors, had people who would put him up, support him. There were probably days that they slept in the orchard or slept by the side of the road, but there were other days when some friends took them in and gave them a good meal. And those people who followed him, who left, like Peter and James and John, who left their fishing boats to follow him not only around Galilee, where they were at home, but followed him eventually to Jerusalem, and all through Israel. So it was an itinerant preacher's life that he led. And it got to the point where he made that conscious choice to go from Galilee, where he was comfortable and where he had a lot of support, to Jerusalem. And the question is, why did he do that? So we get into the final part of this, about Jesus' death and resurrection. And we've got a picture of Jesus who was a teacher, had a reputation to be a healer, was a fairly strong man, a charismatic man who spoke with authority, who spoke as if he really knew what he was talking about, especially when it came to God, his Father. So why did they kill him? Why did they kill him? That's the point. Well, Jesus made his way down toward Jerusalem. And two things happened. If you turn to the very last paragraph there on the back. Lisa, would you mind reading that?
Sure.
The very last one, Mark 11. Yeah.
Then they came to Jerusalem, and Jesus entered the temple. Then they came to Jerusalem, and Jesus entered the temple, and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he said, "Is it not written, my house shall be a house of prayer for all the nations? But you have made it a den of thieves." And when the chief priests and scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching.
Well, those very last few words kind of reiterate what we saw before, that the crowds were amazed, astounded, spellbound by what he said. But Jesus does something very radical here. He does something very radical. He goes to the temple and drives out the money changers, claiming that my house, it is written, my house shall be a house of prayer. Now, why is that a radical thing that he did? Well, first of all, the priests in Jerusalem were kind of like the aristocracy, and their whole income was based on the business of the temple. I mean, they got people to come in to sell doves for sacrifice. Because remember what the temple was. It wasn't like our churches, where you go in for a quiet prayer. The temple, had one section which was the Holy of Holies, which only the high priest went in once a year. But out in front of the temple in the courtyard was this big altar. And on the altar was where the sacrifices were slaughtered and burned, because that was their way of worship. If you had to, for Passover, they had to find every family had to find a unblemished lamb and bring it to the temple for sacrifice. What does that mean? That means that the lamb was slaughtered. That means that the blood of the lamb was thrown on the altar and sprinkled on the people who brought it, because that was a symbol of the connection between the sacrifice and the people. And then it was burned. Well, not all of it. Some of the prime cuts the priests kept for themselves, but most of the carcass was burned as an offering to God. And as the smoke from the fire went up, that was the prayers of the people going up to God in that sacrifice. So, and of course you had to pay for the animal that you sacrificed, and you couldn't pay for it with Roman coin. You had to pay for it with temple money. So that there were guys there as well who would change your Roman coins for temple coins. Of course, with a little fee, a fee for the transaction. So the temple was big business. And not only that, the temple was where the Jews believed that God and humans connected. I mean, yeah, they believed that, when you're reading the scriptures, you were reading God's word. But in the temple, that's where God promised to reside. That's where God promised to remain. That's where God promised to meet his people. And that's why the sacrifices took place there. And Jesus goes in as if he owned the place and starts cleaning it out and saying all kind of things. And in every gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, has the account of that event. But John's gospel adds something different. And when they asked him, why are you doing this? Jesus says in John's gospel, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will rebuild it. Of course, we know that he was more talking about himself than the building. But two things there. One, the people who were listening to him said, you got to be nuts. It took us 40 years to build this temple, and you're going to rebuild it in 3 days? But see, he was comparing himself to the temple, as if to say the temple was where Jews believed God met humans. But that's changing. Here, in me, is where God meets humans. And so you destroy this temple, and in 3 days, I will rebuild it. That was a very powerful statement. And it was only after years and years of reflection that the Christian community recognized what Jesus was talking about there. But it was a political statement as well, because he was challenging the the powers that be that ran the temple, which ran the Jewish religion. And if you were challenging the temple, you were also challenging Rome, because it was the priests in the temple who had to control the crowds in the temple on those big holidays. So now the Romans were worried about it as well. And it seems like, just like Jesus' baptism by John was a pivotal moment in his life, moving from his hidden life to his public ministry, this event was another pivotal event in his life that kind of set the wheels in motion for his execution. So that's why we say that that critical event provoked his demise as nothing else could. Well, how did Jesus die? Well, it's a matter of history. He was tried by the Jewish leaders. Then he was taken to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, in order to get the death penalty. Pilate gave in for the sake of keeping the peace, especially when he asked Jesus, "Are you a king?" And Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world." And Pilate says, "You are a king." And then he started to get scared. Why? Because the chief priest said, if he is a king, he puts himself up against Caesar. And if you free him, you are no friend of Caesar, because he becomes Caesar's rival. And that's when Pilate kind of backs off a little bit and gives in and agrees to a brutal scourging. And if you saw that movie, by Mel Gibson about the passion of the Christ, then you see how brutal that was. And then finally, his execution. Jesus wasn't the only guy executed then. He wasn't the only guy crucified in the first century. That was the Roman, that sort of death, because of its brutality, was the ones that the sort of death that the Romans saved for anyone who challenged their authority, who put themselves up as a rival against Caesar, who wanted to overthrow the Roman rule. So in the first century, and there were a few who, itinerant preachers who eventually preached the kingdom and were crucified as seditionists, as rebels, as people who challenged the current system. And so basically, that's why he was killed. That's the motivation that brought the leaders together in a conspiracy to execute him. And he was buried by some friends. But just like he said on that day, we celebrate his Palm Sunday, when he cleansed the temple, on the third day, he rose. Now, whereas the crucifixion was a historical event because people witnessed it, and it's recorded not just in the Gospels, but it's recorded in non-religious writings. The resurrection is not a historical event in the same way, because nobody saw it. How do we know about the resurrection? Because Jesus appeared in his resurrected body to his friends and disciples. And it's their witness that we read in the Gospels. Plus, they ran to the tomb, as you remember the story, and they found it empty. An empty tomb, even by itself, is no proof, because somebody could have taken the body. But when you combine the two, it gives a little bit of credence to what the disciples were saying. We have seen the Lord. That's what they kept saying. We have seen the Lord. And he spent a period of time after the resurrection until one day where he took his place at the right hand of the Father, at that event that we call the ascension. So we don't know what that body looked like, his resurrected body. We do know that he seemed to be able to come through walls, come through locked doors, but yet he ate with his disciples. He had breakfast of fish with them, and they were able to touch him as Thomas did. Remember Thomas, I'm not going to believe this unless I can touch the wounds in his hands. Yeah, what a brash young man. And yet Jesus said, there you go. Touch, believe. But then he said, blessed are they who have not seen me and have believed. And that's why I said at the very beginning, the witness of the apostles and the followers of Jesus is not just a newspaper article. It's not just a history. It's a witness. It's something that changed their lives, and some of their number felt compelled, especially when the first eyewitnesses started dying off. They felt compelled to start writing things down, writing what Jesus did. But what they wrote not as a objective observer, but as a faith-filled witness. And that's why we have in the Gospels, the witness of the early Christian community uh, talking, or rather communicating what they believed to be the truth about Jesus of Nazareth. Now, just to recap, and you think for yourself, what is your image of Jesus? I showed a bunch of pictures at the beginning. There's a couple of pictures around. But what is your image of Jesus? How did he appear to you? Or how does he appear to your mind's eye? You know, long hair, short hair, rugged, uh, beard, no beard. I mean, we don't know. We all form those images in our heads. But hopefully today, we've gone over a couple of things that the early eyewitnesses have shared with us to let us know who this Jesus was.